Morning, everyone, once again. Have you all got this book, this grey book? Good. If anyone hasn't, please say. All right? Good. So, before I begin, I just want to let you know that President Ikeda sent his best wishes to you all. I had a very short message, having sent him a note saying that we were holding our summer courses, and he said, "Thank you very much for your report. Please send my very best wishes to everyone, and I am praying for the great success of your summer courses." So, Sensei is quite thinking of us at the moment. Right, so today we're going to study together a very important document in the history of Kosen Rufu, which is a thesis written by President Toda, the second president of Soka Gakkai, as you know, and as you see, it's entitled The History and Conviction of the Soka Gakkai. This is an important document because it was written, as you see, in 1951, just a few years after the end of World War II, when, as a result of the government of Japan's persecution of the Soka Gakkai leaders and their imprisonment, and the complete collapse of the morale of the priesthood at that time, the great law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo could very easily have disappeared into the darkness and stayed there. And this thesis by Mr. Toda was written, I think, because of his feeling that he wished to set out on record what had happened in the time of Mr. Makiguchi, who, as you know, had died in prison, the past history, in fact, of the Soka Gakkai, a very short one. It was founded in 1930. And he wished to express his feelings about what had happened in the past and what lessons could be gained from it, and to express his feelings for the mission of the Soka Gakkai and for his own mission as its second president for the future. So he was actually inaugurated president on the 3rd of May 1951. So this was written just 2 months later. And he set out in this thesis particularly the struggles which Mr. Makiguchi had to go through, his predecessor as first president, and the very serious problems which Mr. Makiguchi encountered with the priesthood. He also wanted to talk or frankly admit two great mistakes which he, Mr. Toda, had made in the first early years after the war, when he was struggling to build the Soka Gakkai once again. And he emphasized the mission, the great mission of the Soka Gakkai as he saw it in the future, and also the need for a whole new attitude on the part of the priesthood. So it's very relevant, this, to our own times now. And in fact, really, I suppose you could say this document is describing our inheritance today of the true law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, really. So that's very important from our point of view. So to grasp it, I think we have to look back for a little while, a few moments, to those times, 1951, 40 years ago now. Some of you were already sort of 41, let's think. One or two of you may have been in your 20s then, like I was. most of you were just about being born around that time, or even hadn't been born at all. So it's a long time ago in some ways, although in terms of the history of Buddhism, it's just a very short moment, 40 years. So if I may, I'll just try and explain the situation as it was. I think also those of you who have read, and I hope you will all read if you haven't already, the plea made by the four great pioneer leaders of Soka Gakkai, who had practiced more than 50 years since the time of Mr. Makiguchi, which was published in the Bulletin, in the last issue of the Bulletin. If you haven't read it, do please try and grab a copy from somewhere and read it, because their practice spans the whole period from the times we talk about here. And their plea is a very moving one, addressed to one of the senior priests in the head temple. So, 1951, 6 years after World War II, and at that time Japan was still in ruins. It's not always understood by everybody because we concentrate so much on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's always so strongly, naturally, in people's minds. It isn't always realized that every city in Japan was virtually destroyed. And there was total chaos, in a sense, social chaos everywhere as a result of the aerial bombing, which had been very specific in destroying these cities. And except for Kyoto, Kyoto was spared because of its cultural importance. And the economy of Japan had totally collapsed. This was, of course, partly due to the destruction of the war, but it was also due to the fact that Japan had been at war for many years before World War II, as you may know, in China and Manchuria. And the combination of all those years of war plus the destruction of World War II caused their economy to be totally disintegrate. And there was severe inflation at that time. Black market trading, of course, was rife. And virtually everyone, in terms of the ordinary people, were poverty-stricken. They had clothes that they had made for themselves somehow out of bits of material. And things were still very bad, even at that time, in 1951. So far as Nichiren Shoshu and the Soka Gakkai were concerned, and I mention them both because Nichiren Shoshu, strictly speaking, is the title of the priesthood. That is, the Nichiren Shoshu, the priesthood of what was known as the Orthodox, or is known as the Orthodox sect of Nichiren Buddhism. And the Soka Gakkai, it's lay society. So, as you know, First President Makiguchi had died in prison because he absolutely steadfastly refused to incorporate anything to do with Shinto in Buddhism. And the government of those days wished to control the people by emphasizing emperor worship in order to gain unity and allegiance amongst people of all types. And they were insisting that all religions should incorporate these beliefs in those religions. So Mr. Makiguchi stood absolutely firm and refused to obey. He refused to have a Shinto shrine in his home, for example. And then also he heard that the priests at the head temple were giving in their fear and fright of persecution by the government, and that they, of course, were under pressure by the government to actually have a Shinto shrine in the head temple itself. And to his horror, he found or heard that they had actually enshrined a Shinto talisman at the head temple in Taisekiji. An incredible thought these days, but that's what had happened. And he was called to the head temple and asked to give in by the priests, and he refused. And all the members of the Gakkai, not more than about 3,000 at that time, they all stood strongly against it. So as a result, the government, of course, hearing about this, arrested Mr. Makiguchi, arrested Mr. Toda, and 20 or more other leaders of Soka Gakkai and imprisoned them. And other members who were practicing, if they continued, had to do so secretly, underground, in other words. So it was very terrible times. Mr. Makiguchi died when he was 74 in prison, in solitary confinement, after continuous interrogation and attempts to brainwash him into giving up his faith. And Mr. Toda also underwent the same treatment, as did the other leaders of the Gakkai who were in prison. And the only two that stood firm and never gave in were Mr. Makiguchi and Mr. Toda. One by one, the other leaders, I'm afraid, gave in and gave up their faith. So after the war, or as war ended and Japan was being invaded by the Allies, Mr. Toda was released from prison, as you know, and the story is being told at the moment in the UK Express in the first volume of the Human Revolution. And Mr. Toda, although he was desperately sick, was determined that he mustn't delay one moment in trying to build the Gakkai again, and build it, of course, to a strength where it could never be in danger of being destroyed. And he took various steps in order to do that. These are interesting because they're really the fundamentals of our faith, or the tools of our faith, perhaps. The first thing was he asked the high priest of those times, a man called Nichiren Shoshu, if the Soka Gakkai headquarters could have a gohonzon. At that time, no gohonzons had been given for buildings except to temples. So it was a first step which the high priest readily agreed to grant the Soka Gakkai a Jojo gohonzon, which was then enshrined in their headquarters, which was a tiny house in Shinano-machi on the same area, the same site as the present headquarters is. And this was a great and, of course, very important event, the enshrinement of this gohonzon. A Jojo gohonzon, for those who don't know, means a gohonzon that is specifically inscribed and dedicated by the high priest for a particular purpose or person or organization or institution. So it was a Jojo gohonzon which was specifically inscribed and then dedicated in Japanese characters to the Soka Gakkai and the movement for Kosen Rufu. And the second thing Mr. Toda did was to, with the help of a retired high priest, compile a volume which contained all the Gosho. It's hard for us to believe now, because we're so well served with literature, that at that time the Gosho were not available to the lay people. They remained in the head temple, and there was no way in which ordinary people could get hold of a book or a piece of paper with the Gosho on it. And so it was a tremendous achievement, compiling this book containing more than 470 theses and letters from Nichiren Daishonin, and making that available to the ordinary believer or member. And then the third point was that up to that time, the lay people did not practice as the priests did. That is to say, they didn't do gongyo daily, twice daily, as we do now. They chanted a bit of daimoku here and there, and if they felt particularly like it, they might perhaps recite the Jigage portion of the Lotus Sutra, or even the Juryohon or the Hobenpon chapters, but this was not in any particular form and was not of great stressed as of great importance for the lay people. The lay people's duties had been to support the priests. Very similar, in other words, to the sects that followed the provisional teachings and Hinayana Buddhism, where the lay people, through donations or giving food to the priests or cleaning the temples and so on, were making causes which would bring them a good effect, but they were not actually practicing as bodhisattvas of the earth. And so Mr. Toda, again, with the full agreement of the high priest with whom he discussed the matter, instituted gongyo. Some of you may say, oh gosh, what a pity. But in fact, of course, as you well know, though you may sometimes groan at having to do gongyo, once you've done it, you have no doubt about its greatness. And the more that happens, the more you long to do it. So, in fact, it was a tremendously important step, of course. So even to this day, by the way, the Hokkaido sect, which is linked with this Danto movement of little groups of believers assembled round a priest based on the local temple, still they don't do gongyo necessarily regularly. But Mr. Toda's view was that since the mission, he strongly felt the mission of the Gakkai was to fulfill the will and testament of Nichiren Daishonin in spreading the movement for Kosen Rufu and the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, which had not been done up to that time, neither by the priests nor by the few 1,000 or 2,000 or so lay people who made up the parishioners, as it were, around based on those local temples. But he was convinced that if they were to do it successfully and win, gongyo was vital. And Mr. Makiguchi, of course, had passed that strong belief on to Mr. Toda. So, at any rate, from that time onwards, the Gakkai grew based on gongyo twice daily, exactly as we do it now, and exactly, of course, as the priests do it. And as you know, the purpose of gongyo is to defeat the negative influences or impulses in one's life. So I have no doubt Mr. Toda was right, and I'm sure even though sometimes you may groan, you can have no doubt too that Mr. Toda was right. Because really, gongyo is the driving force of this whole movement, isn't it? So fortunately, at that time, there followed three great high priests. The first was the one I just mentioned, Nichiren Shonin, who was high priest from 1947 to 1956. And he was followed by Nisho was the 64th high priest. He was followed by Nichijun, who was high priest from 1956 to 1959. And Nichijun was followed by the 66th high priest, some of you will have known him, who was Nitatsu Shonin, high priest from 1959 to 1979. So these three high priests totally understood the remarkable appearance of the movement of the Soka Gakkai. Mr. Makiguchi had known them all, not when they were high priests, but when they were priests, and they had also got to know Mr. Toda extremely well in the years prior to the war. And as they became high priests, they strongly supported the Gakkai in its mission, and indeed publicly stated that in their view this was a mission as predicted by Nichiren Daishonin, that eventually, based on the Lotus Sutra itself, out of the chaos of Mappo and the suffering and destruction of that era, the great pure law would arise. This Shakyamuni had predicted all those thousands of years previously. And in their view, the reason why World War II took place and Japan was invaded was that this was the one only calamity or disaster of the 3 calamities and 7 disasters cited in the sutras, which had not yet occurred. So 700 or almost 700 years previously, as you know, the Mongols had tried to invade Japan. And Nichiren Daishonin was called upon to pray for this to be prevented. And in fact what happened was that the Mongols landed, but almost immediately afterwards a typhoon arose and threatened to destroy their whole fleet, and they therefore withdrew back to the mainland. And this happened again, twice running, 8 years later, when they tried again. And at that time, of course, in parts of Japan, especially in Kyushu, the southern island, where the landings took place, Nichiren Daishonin was praised and revered. They built statues to him. One still exists in one town that I went into. And the people were praising Nichiren Daishonin and saying that he had saved the Japanese nation. But sadly, a year or a few years later, all that was forgotten, and the slander of Nichiren Daishonin and his teachings continued, as you know, from the Gosho. So the view expressed by high priests of Nichiren Shoshu has always been that the World War II was the ultimate punishment for very nearly 700 years of slander by the Japanese people. However, out of that disaster of World War II, the great pure law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo appeared. And therefore, the appearance of the Gakkai at that time was totally related by those high priests to the mission described in the Lotus Sutra of the Bodhisattvas of the earth who would appear in order to spread the teachings. So they were clear, these 3 high priests that I mentioned, that the Soka Gakkai were appearing as predicted, the Bodhisattvas of the earth appearing out of nowhere almost, it seemed, out of the ground, and gradually building and increasing in numbers as the Lotus Sutra predicted. As many, it says, as the sands of grains of sand of 10,000 Ganges rivers, meaning an awful lot of people. And amazingly enough, of course, Mr. Toda managed to build the Gakkai up to the time of his death, which was not many years later, 1958. He built it up to more than 1 million families. So this was a colossal and incredible effort. And it was as if, as Mr. Toda had put it, Phoenix was arising out of the ashes. of a destroyed Japan. So really, that's the sort of general background. In other words, Mr. Toda, at that time, by the various steps which he took, Gongyo, compiling the Gosho and so on, was laying the foundation on which the Soka Gakkai could build itself. And you'll also notice when you read this through that Mr. Toda talks a lot about Kosen Rufu of the Orient. Only once does he mention Kosen Rufu of the world. The reason for that, of course, was that so far as the people of Japan were concerned at that time in 1951, not only in Japan but throughout the Far East was their world. Of course they knew of the existence of the West, but communications were still comparatively primitive. Most people were still traveling and reaching the West by long sea journeys, by ship, and aerial transport was still in its primitive state so far as airlines were concerned. And added to that, of course, telecommunications were also primitive, nothing like they are today, where we pick up the phone and ring the other side of the world almost as a normal matter. Even when I was a boy, my father would refuse to use the telephone for anything further than the outskirts of London itself. If my mother suggested she ring her relations in Scotland, he used to throw up his hands in horror. So things have changed so much, it's unbelievable. So this was the world, anyway, in which this particular document was written, and the circumstances which surrounded Mr. Toda at that time. So, of course, our concern is with the now and with the future, but one has to know something about the past in order to understand the present, and certainly understanding the past and the present enables us to shape a future in a wiser way. So now we'll start to read. Donnie McLennan's going to. He was worrying about his Scottish accent, but I said I thought you'd all understand completely. So off you go, Donnie.
Okay. Part 1, July 10th, 1951. When the first president, Tsuneburo Makaguchi, stood up to lead the Soka Gakkai and propagate the true law, Nichiren Shoshu believers had forgotten that one is punished when one opposes this great law. That's why he chose to expound the theory of punishment both inside and outside of Nichiren Shoshu, thereby meeting every persecution in his attempt to propagate the great law. There were even priests who attacked him by saying that emphasizing the theory of punishment contradicts the doctrines of Nichiren Shoshu. However, President Makaguchi was resolute in his expounding the dreadfulness of the punishment that one may receive by slandering the law. Until the last moment of his life, he remained resolute in proclaiming the real punishment of the law. Mr. Makaguchi, my mentor, would often say, "The Gohonzon has great power." The fact that the Gohonzon has great power also means that if you slander it, you will be punished. If a father is not upstanding enough to scold his children, how can he help them to become happy? Pray to the Gohonzon sincerely. Can't you hear the Gohonzon say to you that if you slander this law, you will have your head broken into 7 pieces? This statement, which we can read on the Gohonzon, actually refers to the punishment one will receive by slandering it. I agree with Mr. Makaguchi's central contention. If you deny his view, you do not actually believe in the awesome power of the Daikohonzon. Those people who oppose the theory of punishment are no different from those who are seduced by the superficial compassion of Shakyamuni's Buddhism. I say that they do not embody the true spirit of Nichiren Shoshu. I repeat this. In the upper right-hand corner of the Gohonzon, in other words, if you slander this law, you will have your head broken into 7 pieces. Doesn't this signify the theory of punishment? At the same time, in the upper left-hand corner of the Gohonzon is an inscription that reads, "If you make offerings to the law, you will receive more good fortune than that derived from holding the 10 titles of the Buddha." Doesn't this signify the promise the Gohonzon makes to us that we will receive benefits when we worship the Gohonzon? Benefit or value and punishment or anti-value constitute the reality of our daily lives. Some Nichiren Shoshu priests had forgotten that the power of the Ganzen can be revealed in one's daily life in either way until President Makiguchi discussed it. They were astonished at what he brought out, and I am dumbfounded that many of them have since pretended that they have known this principle very well from quite some time. Also, some priests are not yet aware of this principle. I am saddened rather than surprised by their ignorance. In the Gosho on persecutions befalling the Buddha, Nichiren Daishonin states, in the latter day of the law of both Shakyamuni and the Buddhas before him, the rulers and people who despised the votaries of the Lotus Sutra seemed to be free from punishment at first, but eventually they were all doomed to fall. This passage clearly indicates that the person who slanders the great law will receive severe punishment. Who can deny this? That would be a slanderous act, and those who do so are evil and foolish. The Daishonin also says in the same Gosho, the deaths of Oto Shikamaza, Nagasaki Tokisuna, and Daishinbo, for example, who were all thrown from their horses, can be attributed to their treachery against the Lotus Sutra. There are 4 kinds of punishment: general and individual, conspicuous and inconspicuous. The massive epidemics, nationwide famines, insurrections and foreign invasions suffered by Japan are general punishment. Epidemics are also inconspicuous punishment. The tragic deaths of Ota and the others are both conspicuous and individual. Each of you should summon up the courage of a lion and never succumb to threats from anyone. President Makiguchi made the heart of this passage his own. Even though he was alarmed, he was neither scared nor astonished. Rather, he continued to expound on the punishment one will receive by slandering the law. He persisted in his theory of punishment. Thus, he was criticized by those both inside and outside Nichiren Shoshu.
So we'll pause there and just consider that broadside. So it sounds awful, of course, doesn't it? Having one's head broken into 7 pieces. But in fact, it's rather a dramatic way of saying something that's very logical and very simple. And of course it doesn't mean that one's head suddenly, literally, flies into 7 pieces like a jigsaw puzzle thrown into the air. So we are experiencing, in small ways or great ways, benefit or punishment all the time. We can understand quite clearly that there is negative and positive influences within each one of us. And I think it's quite understandable to us too that there is no grey area in between. There's no neutral zone. There's no sitting on the fence so far as these negative and positive impulses are concerned. We are either thinking, speaking, or acting or doing positively or negatively. There is nowhere in between, is there? So having agreed that everything, that is the way life works, therefore we have to agree too that things that happen to us, or our thoughts, or what we say, are either valuable or not valuable, value or anti-value, positive or negative. So we see, therefore, that these changes from positive to negative can be like a flash, can't they? In a moment, our minds, caused by something usually that happens outside us, which creates some thought in us, all happening like a flash of lightning, can make us think badly about someone, or the next minute something else can happen and we think, oh, not a bad person after all. I think I'll get to know him, and so on. So all throughout every living moment, this is happening within us. We can't help it, because that is life. these impulses, positive or negative, are life itself. And furthermore, Buddhism teaches that it is that battle between these two opposing forces which creates the very energy of life itself. So there's nothing we can do about it. It's there. But on the other hand, we would rather have it under our control than out of control. And this, of course, we realize more and more because Buddhism gives us the way to control it and to quickly switch negative impulses into positive by the simple act of chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, even 3 times inside us. We can do that. So slander, of course, is the bad side of these impulses, where our life is for a moment, or for more than a moment, filled with negative influences. And we think badly about someone or something. And true, the worst form of slander, of course, is bearing hatred or bad feelings, particularly about someone who is a fellow member and who is also practicing and doing their utmost to bring out their Buddha state and challenging their human revolution just as we ought to be. So you get examples of this business of punishment or benefit very clearly, often. And maybe you're walking out of a room and something reminds you of someone you don't like. Or perhaps you've got to see someone you don't like. And as your mind begins to detest the thought of having to go and see this person, you close the door behind you and leave your finger in it. Or you get out of your car and you knock your head badly. That's very great good fortune. If you have the good fortune to be reminded that you're slandering, and if you have the perception to see that, then you can give yourself a good shake and chant a few daimoku for that person that you've been slandering. That's real good fortune. So we can, of course, through our daimoku, and through asking for the perception to see when we slander, we can build this sort of good fortune. And it really is good fortune, even though your finger may hurt, or your head may hurt after you've banged it on the car door. So it's important, therefore, to desire to overcome one's slander and express this desire as regularly as possible in one's daimoku, if one feels one is slandering. And particularly for the wisdom to see when you are slandering. This is really a valuable thing to do. So, of course, there's no magic about this. The term Gohonzon is used, and the power of the Gohonzon. But, of course, what is actually the heart of this whole situation is the Gohonzon within oneself. If one slanders, one blocks off the Buddha state of one's life. And you block off, if you block off your Buddha state, therefore you block off your wisdom, your compassion, and all the other wonderful qualities of Buddhahood. So therefore, if you take it to an extreme, what one might call major slander, where you are really hating someone else, say, then this becomes an obsession. Your mind can become totally absorbed the moment that person comes into your mind, and it may take you another hour or two to get over it. That obsession, that hate, is blocking your life, blocking your Buddha state, blocking your good qualities, and therefore distorting your thinking. So having your head broken into 7 pieces means you are no longer capable for a period. It may only be 5 minutes, but it could be 3 weeks or a month. You're no longer capable of thinking in a rational, logical way, because your mind is imbalanced by this negative hatred that you have for this particular person. Or it could be, with some people, even hatred of the Gohonzon, or hatred of someone who's practicing to the Gohonzon. So, although it sounds a dramatic thing, having your head broken into 7 pieces, what it means is your whole life becomes out of balance. Therefore, you cannot think in a logical, straight, sensible way. You're denying the great qualities of humanity from being uppermost in your lives. And we can, as a result of that, think wrongly, act wrongly, and so on. So this is what having your head broken into 7 pieces means. It's all within us. We create the situation for having our thoughts and our thinking process, if you like, distorted and disrupted by obsessive slander about someone or something. So this is very real, and it's incredible that it should not be have been taught at one time. And Mr. Makaguchi realized that from the pure view of compassionate view of helping people to overcome their sufferings, an understanding of punishment, as it's known, as well as benefit, is essential. Otherwise, there's something vital missing, isn't it? And you're withholding happiness from people as a result. So far as small slander is concerned, none of us can help it. We're small slandering every day. We go for a walk and tread on insects. We see a wasp and swat it, because we'd rather do that than see our small child stung by it, or whatever it may be. We pull up living plants and eat them, as well as, of course, meat and so on, and fish. The whole universe is based on the fact that one form of organism is supporting another. Of course, the most graphic sight of that is a lion killing an antelope to eat. Without the antelope or the zebra or the wildebeest or whatever it is, he can't live and can't feed his young and so on. It's a gory, horrible sight. People go, ugh, when they see movies of it. But there you are. That is life. We can't help treading on insects. We have to eat ourselves. Plants and fish and meat and all the rest of it. So this is part